afternoon, I was asked to introduce our inaugural 2025-2026 Colloquium speaker for the School of Teacher Education. So I am pleased and proud to present Dr. Carlo Cinaglia, who came to us very recently from Michigan State University, where he was an instructor and a recent graduate from the same PhD program I graduated from over 20 years ago. It was actually almost exactly 20. We're about to have our 20th reunion celebration here in a few weeks. So I guess that's why they asked me, right, kind of mission. Is that what you asked me?
Yes,
you graduated the same program. Okay. I don't have anything else to say except here it is.
My name is Carlo Cinaglia. Before I say anything else, how about a round of applause for the Colloquium Committee who organized all of this? Can you remind us who all is on the Colloquium Committee?
Yeah, so Colloquium Committee this year is myself, Rob Schoen, Matt Cooper working meeting, who is not able to be here today, and Shannon Boyd. So if you have any questions or anything, those are the 4 folks that are organizing currently.
Nice.
Thank you all for coming.
How many people here are grad students? All right.
Yeah.
When I was in my grad program, we didn't have something like this. I really wish we did. When I first heard about this event in our first sort of faculty meeting at the beginning of this semester, I thought, wow, that sounds really cool. I wish we had something like that. I wish there was something in my grad program where students and faculty could learn a little bit more about each other's research. I think that was an area where people could maybe learn a little bit more about each other. And so I think this is a really cool idea, and I jumped at the opportunity to participate because I'm interested in learning about my colleagues. And come on in. So yeah, I am an assistant professor in the second language education program. So I work and teach and study and function in the world of additional language education. And so yeah, I'm going to talk today about some research that I did as part of my dissertation study. I'm calling it Investment in Language Learning and in Continued Language Study at a US University, a Narrative Inquiry. In the background, there's a picture of a room with a bunch of different seats that are empty. That could symbolize a couple different things. It could symbolize class is over, a class is not in session. It could symbolize people aren't coming to class. The thing that I'm interested in is why students choose to study additional languages or why they might stop studying additional languages. So an empty classroom could represent somebody deciding not to study a language anymore. An empty classroom might represent a university where the administration decided to not fund language programs anymore, right? So there are lots of things going on in the world of additional language education in the United States. I'm just trying to visualize that. These are 2 organizations that generously funded my research: ACTFL, formerly the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and the National Federation of Modern Language Teachers Associations. If you do work related to language education and you're interested in learning about these research grants, I'd be happy to talk to you later on. I didn't know about them when I started my PhD program until another graduate student told me about them. So if that sounds like you and you want to chat afterwards, hit me up, let's talk. Okay. I wasn't sure exactly how to structure this presentation, and so I decided to structure it much like we would a normal presentation of a research project. The reason I'm intentionally signposting this intuitive structure is I was thinking about who the audience might be today, and I thought, okay, my new colleagues might be interested in learning about the kind of work that I do, what topics, what methods, and my students and other students in the department might be interested in thinking also about what topics and methods and tools that I use, but also thinking about how do we do this thing of presenting research. And so what I wanted to kind of do was signpost a little bit and explicitly make clear, particularly with the background and the framework and method, how I'm situating my study as part of an ongoing conversation and sort of making clear how I'm using theoretical and methodological tools in my work, right? So just ways to think about how we organize and present information when we do things like present at conferences. And maybe for the grad students, maybe you're like, yeah, I've presented a million conferences, I know how to do that. When I was a graduate student, I had not presented at a million conferences, and so it was really helpful to see a couple examples of that. Okay. So what's going on in the world of US post-secondary additional language education. I always start with this picture when I present this project. What you see here is information data from the MLA, the Modern Language Association of America. Every few years, they collect and share enrollment data. The number of students enrolled in programs, language programs in the United States. So world language education, we're thinking languages other than English, in this case, in US universities. And so it's really small, you don't have to look at the whole thing. What I'm trying to draw your attention to is the peak at the top over there is data from the year 2009. And then since that year, there's been a steady decline since 2009. So for the past 15 years or so, in the field of language education, we've kind of noticed this decline in enrollment in US higher education, world language enrollment, and trying to think, what do we do about this, right? So this is a topic that's been in the news. This is Scott Jachik used to write for Inside Higher Ed. So this idea of declining enrollments is something that's been talked about in Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, places like that. We know that around the country and in other places, for lots of reasons, there is some skepticism towards the value of a humanities degree and a little bit more emphasis on STEM or pre-professional programs. I'm not challenging that. I'm saying that is complex and informed by lots of factors. But we also know that these trends have material consequences for our students and our colleagues. So you might be familiar with what went down at West Virginia University in late 2023. I feel like every 3 or 4 weeks now, I get an email that says, this university in this place is proposing to cut funding to this language program, or this university in this place is proposing to cut funding to this humanities program. Please sign this petition, retweet, repost this petition to prevent the defunding or cancellation of this program. So this is a thing that's going on in universities in the United States, but also in other Anglophone contexts. And so this is a little bit about why I think it matters, not just for like theoretical questions in applied linguistics and language education, but like what's going on in the world, right? Okay, so when we look at recent research examining this very specific topic of world language enrollment at the post-secondary level in the United States, if we look at studies over the last 5 years, I would put them into 2 categories. One category I might call the breadth approaches, and one category the depth approaches, right? The breadth approaches, just in the last 5 years or so, a number of studies putting these in chronological order, and then the depth approaches, it's not a huge amount of studies, but I think it's enough to show that in the past couple of years, this is super important. It's a really specific topic, enrollment, right? And so a few more of the breadth approaches than the depth approaches, but this is me. This is where we are today. You are here. This is where we are right now. I'm joining the depth approaches. The breadth approaches are, as you can imagine, larger scale. Here's a preview of sort of what they look like, right? So these studies examine students' interest in language learning in sort of a general sense. They mostly, not all, they mostly use large-scale questionnaires conducted at one time point from a large number of students, asking them, why would you be interested in hypothetically studying a language? Why would you maybe hypothetically be interested in taking a language course? And the main findings from this group of studies is that things like curricular requirements, scheduling constraints, personal interests or lack thereof, all inform someone's expressed interest in language learning and potentially enrolling in a class. Interesting, fine, important. And a lot of these studies, the implications offered from these studies come mostly in the form of recruitment strategies to raise students' awareness of the value of language learning, right? And so the onus is kind of on the student to change their mind about whether or not additional language learning is important. The depth approaches, as you can imagine, complement the breadth approaches that take a slightly different approach. The depth approaches focus not just on students' interest in language learning in the general sense, but they focus on students' learning experiences and specifically their enrollment and continuation trajectories. And so these studies are smaller in scale, but greater in depth. They use multiple different data collection procedures, usually longitudinal, collecting data at multiple time points. The findings of the depth approaches studies are similar to the breadth approaches, but also showing how students' ideas are influenced by factors at different scales of social context, so kind of thinking ecologically, and also thinking about how students' approaches to why they might want to study language, how their ideas change over time, right? What's interestingly different about these two different groups of studies is whereas the breadth approaches to studies offer implications in the form of general recruitment strategies, the depth approaches offer implications that are much more grounded in pedagogical practice, classroom instruction, curriculum design, and teacher development. And so I think that's something that's kind of important. And so I'm over here. When I started this study, I thought, oh, the breadth approaches are like bad and the depth approaches are good, and I'm going to be the good guy because we need more of the depth approaches, right? No more large-scale surveys, not another survey, right? And I think what's interesting is the Professional Organization Act will is continuing to this day, still trying to do more large-scale surveys. And it probably won't stop. So I feel a responsibility to like contribute to that conversation and say, hey, let's think about what kind of data we're going to collect and how we're going to use it. And so, I don't know, my vision for how I'd like to contribute to this space in the future is to participate in this sort of going in circles in a good way cycle of using multiple approaches to investigate this phenomenon that's really important right now. And so that's my vision, and we'll see. We'll see. Right, so I'm going to talk a bit more now about the tools that I'm using to look at my data, collect my data. Framework and method. So the theoretical framework that I use is called investment, language learning investment, which you can see here. Investment is defined as the socially and historically constructed relationship between language learner identity and learning commitment. So someone's commitment to language study in relation to their identity. Identity, that's a pretty nebulous thing. Sure, one way to think about identity, Bonnie Norton described it as how a person understands their relationship to the world, how that relationship is constructed across time and space, and how that person understands possibilities to the future, for the future. So I'm thinking in terms of how someone understands themselves as a legitimate user of a language, as a successful learner of a language, or as an illegitimate user, an unsuccessful learner of a language, right? How do they understand themselves in relation to what forms of social capital, cultural capital, maybe economic capital they have, right? So different resources people have, different knowledge people have. And also in relation to ideologies, another nebulous term. In applied linguistics and language education, we might describe ideologies as dominant ways of thinking that organize and stabilize societies while simultaneously determining modes of inclusion and exclusion and the privileging and marginalization of ideas, people, and relations. It's a big definition. Ideologies, language ideologies could be something like the native speaker ideology, which says if you grew up using a language, you're a native speaker. And if you learn that language later in life, you're a non-native speaker. And native speakers are legitimate users of a language, and non-native speakers can never become native speakers, and you'll always be different, and it's just two categories, black and white. Another ideology might be the standard language ideology that says even if you're a native speaker of English or Spanish, there are different varieties. There's the standard and there are other varieties. And the standard is the legitimate form. And if you use those other varieties, sorry. Another ideology might be the naturalness ideology. And a naturalness ideology is something, an assumption that says if you maybe have claim or perceived to have a particular ethno-linguistic background, say you identify as Hispanic or Latinx, the naturalness ideology is an assumption that because you have that ethnicity, or maybe you're perceived to have that ethnicity, you should be able to speak Spanish. And if you can't, then you cannot claim that identity, right? So you have all of these assumptions that are taken for granted, that function and that kind of differently value these forms of capital, positioning individuals as legitimate or not, right? So your commitment to studying language is shaped in part by how you understand yourself as a user of language in relation to other people. So if that's not clear yet, I think the examples later on will. This is a sociological, post-structural, very fuzzy construct. It was developed to complement language learning motivation, which kind of came out of psychology. This investment was developed in 1995. It's something that individuals can do, that can invest or disinvest, but it's also something that sort of can be done to individuals. People can be invested or not be invested. If you have a vested interest, if you stand to benefit from this language learning activity, you might be invested, right? So it's this interesting confluence of choosing to do something or maybe not choosing to do something based on different value systems in a particular context. So yes, language learning investment is my theoretical framework. My methodological approach is narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry has a long tradition in education. I'm going to tell you about it in language education. So narrative inquiry and language education, this is a qualitative approach to research that utilizes stories and storytelling as forms of data and as processes for analysis or reporting. So you can use it in multiple different ways. As a form of data, participants tell you a story about their experience. As an analysis or reporting tool, you, the researcher, might construct stories to represent participants' experiences. You might do one, you might do the other, you might do both, right? We don't have hard and fast rules about, but you have to do one of those. So story, it's got to be, we have criteria. It's open, but it's also, what counts as a story? Don't we all collect stories? Stories, reports of experience that have some kind of evaluative component. It's something that is structured in space and time. So it involves somebody making sense of their past, present, or future experience, but it also has some kind of evaluative element. And the telling of the story has a meaning that's outside of the story. In other words, we tell a story not just to recap what happened. We tell a story because we're trying to express something that has to do with the context that the teller and the listener are in, right? And if that doesn't make sense, I'll get to that. I think the visual of the weaving different threads together is a nice way to think about how we tell stories and why we tell stories. We might tell stories about a past event and stories about a present event, and those stories might come together to explain something about how we understand our experience. We might also, in telling a story about the past, in that same interaction, switch and talk about the present and switch and talk about the future. So when we tell stories, we put things together ourselves, and we also thread things together dialogically. If sometimes you're recounting a story with a group of people, stories can be co-constructed when people tell stories together, adding details. And so there's lots of different ways to think about how we use story to communicate with each other and to make meaning. So using story in this way is helpful as a research tool for understanding how people make sense of their experiences and make sense of themselves. Of the many things to consider when doing narrative inquiry are the things in the outside circles here. In no particular order, what is the topic that you're investigating? Who are your participants? Who are you, the researcher? Who is the audience of your ultimate report or presentation? What's the purpose of this project? And what form will your study take? What's the design of the study going to look like? Right? And so these are things to think about when designing a study, when carrying out a study, when reporting a study. And so for me, thinking specifically about participants and audience and purpose, I think about my purpose in two ways. The reason I want to engage in this study and use narrative inquiry is what I call purpose of process, to engage with participants in a way that is supportive of their language learning experience. And what I'll call purpose of product, to come up with something to share with my peers, my colleagues, in a way that's accessible and practical, and not just a list of more recruitment strategies that may or may not be effective in getting students to take language classes, right? And the reason I'm interested in these things is because in the field of applied linguistics and language education, two of the many really important things that we're thinking about recently, two sort of ethical imperatives. One has to do with the first point. If we're going to research students' language learning experiences, we are going to affect students' language learning experiences. We cannot ignore that. And so if that is a fact, we need to think about how we're going to do it in a way that does not negatively affect students and perhaps positively affect students, if possible, and supports them in some way, right? The second would be this question of the social utility of our research. For what and for whom is our research for? Why do we do this, right? What's the point of all of this? And so these are sort of my answers to those questions by thinking, what can I do with this study in a way that's going to try to benefit people? So what I'm doing is I'm combining investment. I should use the past tense. I combined investment and narrative inquiry to understand how students' ideas about the value of language learning are shaped by their classroom experience, but also how those ideas shape what they do in the classroom, right? So we're looking at their classroom experience and their ideas and how they inform one another. Specifically, I'm asking, how does student investment in language learning and in continued language study, looking at the enrollment continuation, how do those things evolve over time, right? Because a lot of the studies recently didn't do that, right? And then two, how does this investment shape their decision to continue or not continue studying a language, right? Okay. I conducted this study at a place I'll call Midwest University, a large research intensive university, we'll say, that has over 40,000 students, huge undergraduate population. However, of the 17 undergraduate colleges, only 4 of them have a language requirement, if that gives you a sense of how institutionally deprioritized additional language study might be. Of the programs of study that have a language requirement, most of them, it was a 4-semester language requirement or a 4-course language requirement. So students could take a language placement test, and if they have 0 experience, they might be placed at French 101, right, or Italian 102, whatever it may be. Regardless of where they're placed, they have to take language classes through that 4th level, 202. So Spanish 202, for example, was the last Spanish course students would have to take in order to satisfy and fulfill the language requirement, okay? And so the language department I was working with, they were interested in particular at looking at that level of that course, Spanish 202, to see, okay, in that level, we notice that Christian students are not continuing after that level, and we want to know why, right? And I would say, well, probably because it's the last requirement. And they're like, yeah, but like, we want to know more. Okay, sure. So I partnered with them to investigate students' experiences in this course in particular. So I recruited 17 undergraduate students. It was important to me that these was a combination of students, some of whom at the beginning of the study were intending to continue, some of whom were not sure, and some of whom were planning to not continue. And I was also interested in students who were declaring or planning to declare a program of study in Spanish, a major or minor, some who were on the fence unsure, and some who were not considering majoring or minoring in Spanish. So I was intentionally trying to get a diverse group of participants there. I was kind of targeting students who might be considered second language students, who did not grow up with a connection to Spanish, who did not grow up with prior experience using Spanish except for informal school. The students who participated in my study spanned a range of different linguistic backgrounds. There were a number of students in my study who might be considered heritage language learners. I'm putting those in quotation marks because I think we should let participants decide for themselves which identity categories belong to them. But a heritage language learner, if you're not familiar with that term, is a broad definition, would be somebody who grew up with some kind of exposure to or connection to, in this case, Spanish, right? So it's not necessarily that they spoke Spanish growing up. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but they might have a familial connection to Spanish, or they might have relatives in the house who speak Spanish, or extended relatives who use Spanish. Maybe they use Spanish, maybe they don't. It's a multifaceted relationship that they have to the language. Okay, so I told you that I'm using narrative inquiry. Some of the procedures that I used to generate and collect data, a number of interviews, some observations, recordings, written reflections, and more interviews. I'm a big fan of interviews, right? So what this looked like over the course of a semester. At the beginning of the semester with every student, we conducted a demographic interview and a language learning background interview, right? So just kind of a little bit about their entire life experience. Over the course of the semester, in multiple iterations, for some students it was 3, for some students it was 2, for some students it was 9. It was different for every participant. I would visit classes, I would sit in the back and take notes. They would record some of their interactions with their classmates. They would produce written reflections, sometimes once a week, sometimes 3 times a week. And we would meet for periodic follow-up interviews, usually every other week, right? And so it was, we had multiple chances to talk in the interview about, hey, this happened in class last week, or hey, you wrote about this in your reflection journal yesterday. Tell me more about that. And so the goal was to use these multiple data collection procedures as multiple windows into somebody's experience, to kind of get like a 3-dimensional view of somebody's classroom language learning experience. And then at the end of the semester, we engaged in a more structured narrative interview, which revisited sort of the language learning background interview, but it was way more in depth. And it was eliciting stories from the participants in a way where they were bringing those stories together to make connections between them. And so in some of these, what I'm going to talk about next, right? So how do we use story as a form of data, as a form of analysis, as a form of presentation? So these follow-up interviews were pretty informal, based on topics students wrote about, based on something that happened in the classroom. And in the process of having those conversations, students may tell a story, right? Maybe not necessarily, right? In the structured narrative interview, all of the prompts are very much, can you tell me a story about this? And so what I'm doing is implicitly and explicitly asking students to make meaning of their experience in the form of a story, if that makes sense. Right, so there were 3 phases that I used to analyze this data. The first was thematic analysis, right? So iterative, at the same time, deductive and inductive coding to see what themes, what topics people were talking about, and how these topics coalesced into themes, right? And so students were talking about different things in their language class that was, I don't know, positive, negative, challenging, successful, interesting, not interesting, comfortable, not comfortable, all different things, right? So talking about these topics and sometimes telling stories about these topics. And then looking at these different storied events, looking at these different snapshot stories that participants would tell, I started to look at how they would temporally and spatially kind of mesh together, bring together these past, present, and future experiences. So when they're talking about their current or recent experience, how are they connecting that to their past experience or their future imagined experience? How are they talking about what happens in their classroom, what happens outside of their classroom? I was trying to learn more about who they are as a person before this class, their life history, right? How they are making sense of the here and now in relation to the there and the then, right? But also in telling stories about their language learning experience, thinking about how the participants positioned themselves, how they described themselves in terms of their use of Spanish, how they described other people in terms of their use of Spanish, their knowledge of Spanish, their ability, their effort, right? And looking at how in describing themselves, describing other people, describing the in-class space, describing the out-of-class space, describing the now, describing the past, describing the future, are these different positions similar, different, are there connections? So trying to see how the participant understands their identity in relation to other people as a legitimate, successful, illegitimate, unsuccessful user of Spanish, learner of Spanish throughout this process, and how that factors into their decision to continue or not. Right, and then so the third stage is where we use story as a representational practice, right? So I'm constructing a matrix, a chronological matrix, an emplotment of events to put things in a chronological order to sort of explain the relationship between them. That's negotiated with the participant. Hey, does this make sense to you? No, change that. Oh, okay, yeah. And then what I did is construct a narrative profile. So I'm writing the findings in the form of a story. This is this participant's story. This is what happened to them, right? And so I'm doing that. I do that to describe the trajectory of their language learning investment over the course of the semester. And so 3 different analytical stages. Okay, I'll preview some of this. Okay, so to show you and tell you about these stories, I'll use this timeline. The solid line in the middle is the semester, the course that's in focus. The dotted lines before and after is just anything in the past, anything in the future that the participants talked about. If it's something that's in a box that's above the line, it's something that seems to support their investment, a reason they might continue. If it's something below the line, it's something that hinders or constrains their investment, a reason they might not continue. They're different colors, those different colors. Oh, sorry. And the other thing is below the timelines are these thought bubbles that represent the initial continuation plan, the evolving continuation plan over the course of the semester, and then the final decision about, am I going to continue after this course or not, right? All of the data collection procedures happen over the course of the semester, and multiple times we're having conversations about the students' plans, their continuation plans, and their ultimate decisions. So the boxes are different colors, and the different colors reflect the different scales of social context. You don't need to remember which color is which, just know that there are different colors. So some students were talking about interactions that happened at the group level in a classroom, maybe the whole class level, maybe something related to the curriculum or an activity related to class, or something outside of the language class. Maybe their academic advisor at the university level or some other degree requirement, or maybe a family member or somebody in their social network, or even just like broader ideas in society. Like it's beneficial for me to learn Spanish to be a supportive teacher to my students who may be multilingual, right? So participants are drawing on all of these scales of context in interpreting their experience. Okay, so 3 cases that we might not be able to discuss too much are Maggie, Amanda, and Chanel. They're all at the time of the study in their first or second year of university. I chose to juxtapose these 2 cases because they represent diverse sociolinguistic backgrounds. Maggie describes herself as Mexican-American. Amanda describes herself as white. Chanel describes herself as African-American. Amanda and Chanel describe themselves as, well, Amanda and Chanel said their dominant language is English. They have no prior experience using Spanish or having a connection to Spanish outside of formal language study in school. Maggie also says her dominant language is English. Maggie also has family members who use Spanish, so she has some kind of connection to Spanish. In the sort of column over the third column, you can see at the start of the semester, what was their plan? At the end of the semester, what was their decision? At the start, Maggie said, I'm going to continue, and decided to continue at the end. Amanda, at the start, decided, I don't think I'm going to continue, and at the end didn't continue. And Chanel was unsure and decided not to continue at the end. So you might think, well, they're not really interesting if they didn't really change course. And I would say we can't take that at face value because each of them had a really complex, not always comfortable experience that shows us why we need to talk to students more about reasons why they might take language classes as expressed in a survey. How are we doing on time? Over.
About 30 minutes.
But it's supposed to be 30 and 30, right?
We can do 15, leave 15 at the end for Q&A.
Oh, sorry, more than 15. Yeah, okay. Okay, good. Okay, helpful. Okay, great. Okay. Trust me. So this is helpful. So each of the narrative profiles that I constructed at that third level, they have a theme. So participants, when they tell a story about their experience, there's some kind of theme. There's some reason they're telling that story to you, right? As the researcher, I'm using story to represent what I think is something interesting for my audience, which is the field of scholars, right, that I'm collaborating with, right? And so the themes that I'm trying to highlight from Maggie, Amanda, and Chanel's experience are these. Maggie's story, the theme of her story, I call redefining successful language learning. I think that's what she did. Amanda's theme is navigating classroom discomfort and interactional dynamics, because that's what she did. And Chanel's theme is about recognizing everyone's developing expertise, right? Trying to position my participants very agentively. So Maggie, redefining successful language learning. I'm going to tell you the most about Maggie. So there's three parts to Maggie's story. We're going to start with her first part, right? So the first part, left you, of Maggie's story is she's starting to feel comfortable, right? So she came to Midwest University. She has reasons why she might want to continue taking Spanish, reasons why she might want to continue taking Spanish, reasons why she's invested, reasons why she might feel less invested, right? At the beginning of the semester, she said, I'm going to continue taking language classes because it's helpful for my career, studying pre-nursing, helpful for my career, and because I want to connect more with my heritage, right? So she describes herself as Mexican-American. She has some family in Mexico. And so she's like, I am expected by them to learn Spanish, and I want to fulfill those expectations. So I want to learn Spanish. At the same time, her family is telling her, why isn't your Spanish good enough? Right? So she's got this complex relationship with Spanish and her family, right? And so that is a theme, right? She talks about how from transitioning to middle school and high school, in middle school, she was the best student in her Spanish classes. Then she got to high school with other students like her, right? Who could actually speak Spanish, she says. And that's when she sort of noticed, okay, I might not be as good at this as some of the other Latina students, right? So she's comparing herself to the people around her using the comparison that her family has sort of created for her, right? So she's got these reasons why learning about her culture, connecting with her family, sort of compel her to want to do this. She'll get the return on her investment for doing that. But at the same time, there are these factors that are telling her, hey, that limited linguistic capital that you have, it's not that valuable because it's not good enough, right? So it's complex. So throughout the semester, she talks about all of these experiences that she has in her language classroom. I titled this part, Seeking Opportunities to Practice. It's really important to her to learn, so she's looking for opportunities to practice her Spanish in class. But she has trouble doing that because in her language classroom, there's not really a classroom language policy that enforces the use of Spanish. Her instructor is really lenient, doesn't force people to use Spanish, and she's terrified to use Spanish because of her partner's comfort level. And she says, I know my partner is not good at Spanish, and if I use Spanish, she'll be uncomfortable, right? So she's kind of like, she avoids using Spanish so that she doesn't want to make her partner uncomfortable because she anticipates that her partner feels linguistically insecure, kind of like the same way that she does. So she's afraid to speak out in the whole class format because she doesn't want to stand out looking like the only person who can speak Spanish, but she's also afraid to do it in the one-on-one because she doesn't want to make her partner uncomfortable. And all of these sort of feelings are reinforced by what she describes as expectations people have of her outside of class based on how she looks. At the same time, she had a couple opportunities to practice. She had a new partner in class who could actually use Spanish. She was able to practice Spanish. She gave a presentation. A presentation, you are expected to use Spanish. She felt like that was a place where her language use was like, it was permissible and sanctioned to use Spanish the way that she uses Spanish. So trying to find these spaces where she is able to just be who she is, right? In talking about her decision to continue around the middle of the semester, she says, you know what? My family, they're always going to have these ideas about me, and I don't think I'm doing this for them anymore. I think I'm doing this for me. So she describes this process of taking it back and doing this, learning Spanish for herself, right? And she's like, and I know that this class might not be ideal. The classroom policy doesn't hold me accountable, doesn't hold anybody else accountable to use Spanish. I might be afraid to use Spanish in class, but maybe it'll get better. Maybe if I just stick it out, maybe the next class, it'll be higher level, it'll be a safer place. Other people will care as much as I care. They'll be as invested as I am. So she's kind of holding out for what might be in the future. That's for her a reason to continue. And then towards the end of our time together, the third part of her story has to do with this idea of language learning effort and language expertise, especially in relation to other people. So she's again sort of reevaluating the criteria for being a successful user of Spanish in relation to her family and their expectations. But she's also finding different people and different places, right? Spaces and forms of social capital where her language practices are valued, right? So she talks about a platform called Talk Abroad. If you have never heard of Talk Abroad, it's a synchronous video chat conversation practice with a language coach who is not a member of your university. In this particular platform, it was a language coach in a Spanish-speaking country is how it was phrased, right? So you're conversing with a native speaker in a Spanish-speaking country. And I could talk more about, how I'm critical of that, but sort of 3 or 4 or 5 times during the semester, students would have this 30-minute conversation with a language coach. It would be video recorded, and they would have to analyze it afterwards, analyze their language use, analyze the conversation partner's language use, and write a thing about it. And she said that was a really cool place because it wasn't my family saying you're not good enough, and it wasn't my classmates who don't say anything and make me scared to say something. It was somebody with whom I could just try. I could just try. I could just be myself, and that was it. That was cool, right? So she is sort of deciding which parts of her ecology inform her criteria for successful legitimate language use. She reevaluates that over the course of the semester. So at the end of the semester, she decides, yeah, you know what, it's up to me. It's what I make of it, right? And so she says, I'm going to keep taking classes because I like this, I can do this. I think it's just, I decide what's successful and I'll see, hopefully future classes will have a more supportive environment in store. I don't know. So she does that. So that's Maggie's story. I'd like to show you a couple examples of data from Maggie's story that I think illustrate this weaving of mini stories together. So if you'll permit me. This story comes later in our time together. So interview 5, a later interview we did, where Maggie is reflecting on her middle school and high school transition that I mentioned about, right? So she says, the biggest challenge that I've had is going from being what I thought was the best, whether that be in class or just me personally with my Spanish, to there being people better than me in terms of speaking the language. So the purple is when she starts to really tell me about this middle school, high school time. When I was in middle school, I was one of the only Hispanic Latino kids in the class. And I was like, you know what? It makes sense for me to be great at Spanish. And then I get to high school and there's other people like me in the class, but they actually know Spanish already. And that's when I started feeling self-conscious. So she's telling me a story about what happened in the past to make sense of how she feels now. It all ties back to me not feeling good enough because I don't speak the language. If I see a white person who knows a word that I don't, or can speak a little better than me, I'm like, what's my problem? So she's having these past experiences and she's still carrying them with them today. Right? So we call that linguistic insecurity, right? In a different interview, she's telling me again about that interaction in the classroom, right? And so again, in the colored text, in this case, red, is that she's narrating to me what happened in the classroom. In yellow is she's evaluating herself. When we get into the group activities, that's where I really want to test my Spanish and really form complete sentences. But my partner, sometimes I feel like I can't really do that. I could, but then I'd have to explain everything I'm saying. And I don't want to make her feel bad for not knowing. So I kind of just started English. I'll move on to this word. I'll go back to English depending on what she's saying and doing, and I'll just kind of follow along, right? So she's kind of projecting this linguistic insecurity. She's anticipating that her partner might feel the same way about her partner's own language use, the same way that she does. And so she's carrying that with her. And then here in a later interview is she's talking again about this idea of trying. So she's talking in the green text about the talk abroad, the video recorded conversations. She's telling me about Spanish class in general. And in this extended term, she starts to weave together these different stories, right? So she said, okay. And I had asked, okay, because she said you have the option to pick conversation partners from around the world. She said, I wanted to pick someone from Mexico because we might have a shared connection. And I said, do you ever bring it up? Do you ever bring up your heritage, right? And she said, I don't know. With my talk about partners, I might have brought it up. And she says, it's always, I feel like I usually don't see a lot of other Mexican people in my Spanish classes. So I always feel like it's so different for me. It kind of feels heavier on me when I'm learning and speaking Spanish. So I definitely was worried going in. I made it a point to myself, okay, you're going to talk to someone who's from Mexico, just so you could have that little bit of relatedness. But I was definitely worried if that were to come up and like, what will they think of me? How will they respond to me not knowing Spanish? Then she switches, and this is the same conversation she tells me a story about a few weeks ago with her family. When I was home for fall break, I went out to a Mexican restaurant with my mom and dad. And my mom said something to the waiter as they went by. And she describes her mom as white and her dad as Mexican. She says, my mom said something to the waiter as the waiter went by, and my dad turned to me and he was like, why don't you ever say anything? And she said, he's never asked me that before. I was honest with him. And I was like, mom's white. And I was like, I feel like it's very different for mom to try to speak Spanish versus me trying to speak Spanish. I feel like I get more judged if I don't speak Spanish or if I attempt to speak Spanish with a Spanish speaking person in public. Whereas if someone like my mom does it, it's like, oh, she's trying, we're laughing, it's funny. But for me, it's more serious. And I feel like I'm kind of looked at weird for like not knowing or if my accent is wrong or weird. So that's why I usually don't, just because I feel like I'll constantly be judged. She said, but with talk abroad, I know it's their job and that's helpful, but it's been really nice just not having to worry about that. I can just try all I want with a native Spanish speaker from Mexico. And yeah, just try, really try. There's a lot we can analyze about how she describes that last part, but I think you can see how she is having these spaces in the classroom, outside of the classroom, co-curricularly related to the classroom where her language practices are being valued and celebrated differently, right? And she's making sense of what that means for her. So there are two additional cases, Amanda and Chanel, that I will come back to if you'd like to talk about. But for the sake of this, I'd like to go through. And I just want to come to this really quick. Maggie started the semester saying, I want to continue, and ended the semester continuing. Amanda planned to discontinue, decided to discontinue, and Chanel was unsure and decided to discontinue. Again, on the surface, at first glance, you might say, that's not that interesting if they don't change course. Well, I think it is. Maggie had a really tough time. As someone who might be considered a heritage language user of Spanish, her interactions with second language users of Spanish, so a classroom that had both heritage language students and second language students, was an environment where she felt not comfortable. Her linguistic insecurity was reinforced, maybe heightened in that space. Amanda and Chanel both describe themselves as English is my dominant language, would probably be considered second language users of Spanish, right? Interestingly, they both had experiences with heritage language students in their classrooms, but it went differently. Amanda was in a group with heritage language classmates, and she felt like she was always being evaluated negatively against her classmates. She was intimidated by her classmates, and she felt like the expectations for her language use were impossibly higher and that she would never meet them, right? So she kind of wrote herself off as, well, it's not in the cards for me. Chanel frequently had group interactions with her heritage language classmates, but because she had an experience where she got to observe her heritage language classmates' own linguistic insecurity or stress and frustration about giving a presentation, for example, combined with part of her classroom experiences, she had a different approach and a different perspective than Amanda. Amanda was just trying to make it through and not be called on because she felt like her instructor was always going to judge her language use next to her heritage language peers who in her mind had perfect Spanish use. Chanel felt like in her classroom space, these were 3 different classrooms. Everybody's language practices were valued, everybody's language practices were celebrated, and everybody was allowed to sort of be imperfectly in development, right? And so they had different levels of what some might call critical language awareness based on the different types of interactions that they had. Right, so that's listed here, and I'll go back to that if you want to see, right? But basically, when we look at all these 3 cases together, what we can start to see is that these ideologies of linguistic expertise and linguistic legitimacy create positions for individuals as successful or unsuccessful language users, and do shape how they decide to invest in language learning practices in the classroom, but also the idea of continued language study, enrollment or not, right? Each of the 3 cases, and other students in the study, had differing levels of access to social capital, if you will, right? So those relationships with classmates or not relationships with classmates, or opportunities to talk with a supportive conversation partner or not in the Talk Abroad platform. All of these things also informed how they were aware of multiple different language ideologies and maybe able to reposition themselves in different ways. All of the participants made sense of their here and now classroom language learning experiences. Well, all of them, their enrollment decisions were informed by their here and now classroom language learning experiences, which a lot of the prior studies don't account for, don't really talk about. But they also made sense of those here and now language learning experiences in relation to their past life experiences and their future imagined goals, right? So things that I think should be taken into account. And so one of the ideas that I was trying to sort of tease apart is these earlier approaches to surveying a large number of students and asking them about potential interest in hypothetical language learning in a general sense. It's fine, but interest in language learning might be different from commitment to actual language study, right? So looking at language study as a social practice. And so that's, I think, one small way that I'm trying with this project to contribute to that ongoing conversation. Right, so what's concerning to me is a lot of these studies that I looked at earlier that I talked about in the breadth category, not all of them, but many of them either offer implications that put the responsibility on the student to change their mind, or they don't offer implications at all. I'm not saying all research needs to have immediate pedagogical implications. I think it's more complex than that. But I think it's important to think about what we do with this research, because a lot of the people, and this is a friendly criticism of some of my colleagues in the blue column before, spend a lot of limited research funding to do this kind of work and then don't necessarily offer something that is immediately usable by language programs who are desperately trying to retain students and recruit students. And so what I'm trying to do with a depth approach study is to inform potential practices that are within language programs' control that might help them get to know their students in their classrooms a little bit more. So again, thinking about this idea of purpose of process and purpose of product, the research data collection procedures that I used were intended to sort of be supportive, pedagogically, if you will, supportive of student participants making sense of their language learning experience. And the product, the report of what comes out of this study, the things that I write and present, my goal is to use the experiences that the participants talked about to generate ideas for possible things that language educators and language programs can do, hopefully to support student investment in language learning, but just maybe things we should do in general, right? And some of those things have to do with advising, right? So thinking about who advises students and how advising should be much more than just placement test, this is the level you go into, see you never, right? But making sure that the curriculum in a language program is transparent to students, that students' prior experiences are acknowledged, and that we routinely check in with students about their plans to continue taking language classes or not, and not just assume that they're gonna know what's there. Other suggestions have to do with curriculum development, thinking about how we can incorporate students' backgrounds and life histories, how we can make the goal, the learning outcome of language study transparent and realistic. A lot of people think they need to become a native speaker when they enroll in a language class. That's never going to happen, and that should not be the goal. And we should talk about that to our students. We should talk about that to each other, right? We should talk about critical language awareness and sociolinguistic diversity, because that's a real thing that exists, and that language classes should acknowledge that, right? And so I'm not saying that like language learning is not important, but I think it's important to also think about how we develop students' multilingual identities, maybe as like a or the pedagogical learning objective. And 'cause I think that has ramifications for how somebody might see themselves as standing to benefit from continuing to take a language class or not, right? So project that I'm working on right now examines that. Other implications related to some things that we do in the classroom, specifically talking about interactional practices that might validate everyone's linguistic repertoires and make it permissible and like a safe space where people can use meaning-making practices regardless of how they feel about those meaning-making practices. And then also working with instructors in language programs to make sure that our instructors understand the same things we're talking to our students about. Sociolinguistic diversity. The goal is not to master all the verb tenses. The goal is to think of yourself as more multilingual than you were yesterday, right? And so I have lots of ideas for how we might be able to do that. I acknowledge that instructors in the language program, whether they're fixed term instructors or graduate students, both are very precarious transient groups, right? And so I'm not saying those people should do this. I'm saying we as a community should create systems where like, collaboratively we might explore something like this together in a way that doesn't just assign labor to somebody else. So those are some ideas that I had about that. There's limitations in future directions, but I'll talk about that later. So thank you everybody for bearing with me and listening to me. I would love to talk about any of the different kind of things. Take a sip of water before I take it.
You can start talking as you're taking that. sip of
Yes, in the front, your name?
Kasha.
Oh, Kasha. Hi, Kasha.
Hi, everyone. So this is really interesting. I really appreciate this work. The thing that I keep thinking about is like, I think it's a methodological also question, where we construct, like, as we construct our stories, we're constructing them as we're living it, right? But also as we reflect on it, depending on the purpose for which we're using that, our lived experiences, right? So whether that's like things like work, grant writing, or scholarships, or things like that, or in different other instances of talk, right? But we're constructing it in the moment and we're constructing it also afterwards. And those stories are sometimes different with different parts, right? So I think what you're doing to capture that in both your data and your analysis is this like iterative collection of data across different places, and then methodologically like these multiple strings that you keep revisiting. But my question is, like, how do you preserve what the participants are saying and feeling and talking about in that moment versus like as part of a larger story towards like overall, right? Also, like, what ingredients are you using, for lack of a better term, for the narrative that you're constructing, right? Because you're telling us about narrative analysis, but there was like the other two parts that you were doing kind of before preparing for the narrative, right? Thematic analysis, and then like I think discourse-driven analysis, right? So in terms of that, like to create, like if I wanted to like create these kind of narratives, because I love the idea of having it be a more approachable way, a more digestible way of like presenting some data, especially I'm thinking maybe for like practitioner pieces.
Yeah.
Like what are the ingredients that we need to construct that narrative so that it is also back to the whole like, you know, like preserving what is said and done in across these different settings, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the first question, how do I maintain the fidelity of the participants' experience in terms of transition, right? And then the second question, what ingredients make for a usable product, right?
Yeah, as not as data, but as method, right? For narrative as
as method? Because you said we can have either or, right? So you don't necessarily need the data of a narrative to construct data as, so that's the part I'm trying to like
Sure.
unpack.
Yeah, so some people collect interview written data that's not necessarily in story form, but they might write a story about it as an analytical approach, show it to the participant, member check, and then they might write a story as a report. That's one approach to narrative inquiry. Some might collect stories from participants in the form of interviews or written reflections. So the data is in story form, then they might write a traditional research report about it. That could also be considered narrative. So both of those things could work. What I aimed for in producing this report was informed by a book that came out in 2022 called Qualitative Literacy, a guide to evaluating interview and ethnographic research by two sociologists. And they posited 5 criteria for qualitative research. And one of them was palpability. The data should be verisimilitude was the quality they talked about. The data should be palpable. You as the reader should be able to look at the data and kind of feel what the participant is experiencing. It should be really vivid. And so what I tried to find were examples from interview or written reflection data where there was a vivid story, where there was something that was just concrete, crystal clear for a reader or for somebody listening to a presentation, for example. Because I think those crystal clear examples, those vivid stories are helpful for introducing an unfamiliar reader to a new person's world, their participants. So I would say one important ingredient would be like a crystal clear, palpable example of data. So that's one thing I'll share in response to that question. And then the question you had about how do you preserve, I'm putting words in your mouth, but how do you preserve the fidelity of the participants' ideas and experiences when you, the researcher, start to, right? And so that's a big ethical thing to think about with narrative inquiry is it's all about representational power. There's a lot of sense making that happens. The participant does sense making with themselves about their experience. The participant then does sense making with you, the researcher. You, the researcher, is doing sense making with the participant. That's dialogic and negotiated and situated. You as the researcher do sense making with your data and your writing and your presenting. And then you as the researcher do sense making to the audience. And then the audience, the reader, has sense making. And so there's a lot of like layers of abstraction and like possible rooms of like misinterpreting stuff, right? So the imperative that you have as the researcher is to like exercise that representational power in a way that advocates for your participants, that positions them as in a positive way, and that also you include them in negotiating that along the way. And so what might be thought of as traditional member checking, I do an interview, analyze my data, bring it back to the participant. Hey, I'm interpreting your experience this way. Does this make sense? Along the way, when we were having those iterative, routine follow-up, semi-structured interviews, it was sort of like okay, how does this look? You know, I'm understanding these two things you talked about this way. Do you understand them this way? Or how do you understand this? And so there's a lot of negotiation with participants. But at the same time, there is sort of like an evaluative, but a representational decision that you make as the researcher. And so, yeah, it involves lots of, I would say, communication with your participants. It might not work best if your data collection is just a one and done thing, if that makes sense. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that start to answer the question? Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, my name is America. I'm a first year graduate student here. I really love this study because I can relate to it in a lot of ways as someone who had to learn English at some point in my life. But I'm really curious of all the participants, the one, Mikey specifically, the ones alive, did they tend to continue, and people who had no emotional connection to the language, like Chanel, did they tend to discontinue? And if that was the case, as practitioners, as an implication for practice, should we be thinking of the broader view of connection to the world? Sometimes we can be in our own world, like, hey, I'm born here, I'm just going to focus on English. Do we need to maybe practice connecting other people to things outside of their own views in those programs?
Yeah, I think some of the recommendations from other scholars have suggested doing things outside of the classroom, community-based service learning, things like that. But not all programs maybe have the resources to do that. So I'm pulling lots of different parts from your question. But it sounded like one of the earlier things you asked was students sort of with different backgrounds or with different experiences, were their enrollment decisions similar or different? Yeah, so a good number of students discontinued because, well, a small portion of the students stopped because it was the last required course. Many of the participants were intending to minor or major in Spanish, so they continued that way. I was kind of more interested in the students who were not interested or the students who were on the fence, but it just turned out that more of the students who wanted to participate in the study, those were the students that I could recruit, right? And so what I was trying to, I guess, what I'm trying to contribute to the ongoing conversation is, if we ask students what might make them interested in enrolling in a general sense, that question might not capture the complexity of how their interest evolves over time and how it's informed by the classroom experience. And so that, I think that is something that can't be ignored. And I think that methodological aspect is maybe a reason why a lot of the implications coming out of the earlier body of studies I talked about don't really suggest doing anything about classroom experience or classroom practice. It's not just outside the classroom. I think taking into account someone's life history, prior experience, family, social network, future goals, we should probably know a little bit about that for all of our students. And it's hard to do that with large classes, I understand that, but I think it's important to think about how those things come together for each individual in making sense of their experience. And so, yeah, I have lots of recommendations for that. So I'm trying not to answer that question really long, because I see we're getting to time and I see people. If anybody has to leave, please feel free to don't.
I think we're over time, so we probably should cut it off officially here, but thank you, Carlo, for speaking.
Thank you very much. We appreciate everyone that was here today. We do have another colloquium on October the 10th. Dr. John Robig is actually going to be presenting, so we hope that you will all come back and join us. We should be in the other room, the G150. It's a bigger space, so that was just, anyway, we'll have there in that space, but be on the lookout for invite for that. And I promise there will be snacks. I will get them. We appreciate everyone and have a great weekend. Thank you.